Hi everyone, it's evening of the August 21st, 1986 in the Bamenda province in Cameroon. Suddenly, 1,746 people and 3,500 livestock died. All life was extinguished in a few minutes. Let's see what happened. The fertile valleys around the volcanic lake Nyos, located in a remote northwestern part of the country, hosted small communities such as Nyos, Subum, and Cha, inhabited by cattle ranchers and farmers. After working all day, on the evening of August 21st, many people were already asleep, and some perhaps intent on finishing their evening meal, when around 9 p.m., a distant rumble coming from the lake, similar to a thunder, echoed in the air. None of the few still awake was surprised, since August is the wettest month of the year along the chain of extinct volcanoes that marks the border between Cameroon and Nigeria. In a flash, more than 1,700 people died. Nobody outside these valleys noticed anything. The first person to communicate that something had happened in the Nyos valleys was the head of the Subum Health Center, Emmanuel Ngumbi, who took his motorcycle to return to his village after spending the night in the town of Hum. When he reached the village of Cha, he smelled a strange odor and felt dizzy. Continuing his journey, he bumped into a dead antelope. He didn't find it too unusual and decided to load it on his motorcycle. But as Emmanuel continued his journey, he noticed more and more dead animals along the way. Soon he came across a group of huts in Nyos. He decided to see if anyone there knew what had happened to the animals. But surprisingly, as he approached the huts, he was stunned to see corpses scattered everywhere. He didn't find a single person still alive. Everyone in the huts was dead. Flustered by what he saw, Mbi rushed back to Hum, where he had worked the night before, to report the disaster he witnessed to his superiors. The president of Cameroon ordered immediate action. It took 2 days for the Cameroonian army troops and medical teams to reach the villages caught in the disaster. Once they arrived, they too found an apocalyptic scene. All the victims had their clothes covered with puzzling greasy stains and seemed to have died from suffocation. Due to fear of an epidemic, the government ordered all bodies to be buried in mass graves as soon as possible. For days and nights, soldiers dug burial pits. Some 300 people that survived the disaster required urgent treatment and were transferred to the hospital in the nearby town of Nkambe. At the same time, the government started a massive relocation campaign for locals. More than 4,000 people were relocated to temporary settlement camps in the first week after the disaster. For half of them, the resettlement became a permanent measure, as their lives back home no longer existed. The first lead in discovering the roots of the tragedy was the fact that the majority of the deceased lived within 12-mile area along the valley running east and west of Lake Nyos. The farther the scientists went from the lake, the lower the number of casualties. Their doubts were supported by the survivor, who testified that on the night of the tragedy they heard a series of rumbling sounds coming from the lake. The thunder lasted for a few minutes and was followed by a strong odor similar to gunpowder or rotten eggs. In the end, the lake's appearance assured the scientists that something strange had happened to it. Lake Nyos, known for its clear blue color, was completely red. Let's better explain this. Lake Nyos is a crater lake that is formed on the top of an inactive volcano, 682 feet deep in the ocuvolcanic plain. In the case of Lake Nyos, because of the tropical climate conditions, the temperature of the superficial water is higher, and consequently less dense and lighter, while the one on the bottom is colder, denser, and heavier. In such a condition, layers do not mix, which stops the carbon dioxide on the bottom of the lake from reaching the surface and escaping into the air gradually. When the water has reached the saturation point of the gases, an unstable situation occurs. At this point, a trigger can lead to the explosive release of the dissolved gas. The triggering cause can be due to an earthquake, strong winds, temperature changes, or particularly heavy rains. In the case of the eruption of the Lake Nyos, it's believed that the trigger was caused by a landslide, although even today there are various debates with conflicting opinions in the scientific environment. What happened to Lake Nyos was a Limnic eruption, also called the overtuning of the lake. Test water samples taken from the lake showed abnormally high levels of carbon dioxide, a piece of evidence pointing to Limnic eruption. The red color of the lake was further proof. It turned out to be dissolved iron. Only Limnic eruption could bring iron sediments to the surface after being stirred up from the bottom of the lake. Based on the calculations made by the scientists, the Limnic eruption of Lake Nyos was one of horrifying scale. It released about 100,000 to 300,000 tons, or 1.2 cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide into the air. In addition, the eruption released other gases from the lake as well, such as sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, hence the smell of rotten eggs that the survivors reported. The released carbon dioxide, 1.5 heavier than the air, formed a 160 feet thick cloud of gas that spread across the valley at the speed of 12 to 30 miles per hour. The result was devastating. No physical damage was done to objects in the area, but most life was destroyed. The UN Disaster Relief Coordinator in Geneva put the final death toll at 1,746, even though the number might be much higher. Around 3,500 livestock were also killed, making the disaster a complete humanitarian catastrophe. Carbon dioxide is present in the air we breathe for the 0.039%, but it can be toxic in higher concentrations. An air mixture containing 10% of carbon dioxide can cause fainting in less than 1 minute, and if no one intervenes, higher levels will cause death. Among all the hypotheses of what triggered the Limnic eruption to date, the only conclusion the scientists could make was that Lake Nyos was again accumulating carbon dioxide. With the mechanism behind the gas eruption still unknown, disaster could strike again. When it comes to how to prevent future eruptions, scientists came up with a surprisingly simple but life-saving solution. They started to install platforms with degassing tubes. In practice, these tubes take the water saturated with carbon dioxide from the bottom to bring it to the surface, so that when the water is at a lower pressure, it releases carbon dioxide safely and in small doses. The first tube was installed in 1995 and assured the scientists that the plan might work. Another tube was installed in 2001 and 2 more in 2011. The system allowed releasing the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent to the amount of gas that accumulates at the bottom of the lake. It was a simple yet effective way to prevent a new disaster similar to one in 1986. Today, Lake Nyos still has the same iron-red color it turned after the Limnic eruption. The lake valley lies empty with ruins of once prosperous villages.